Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Another 2018 Formula One car that has broken cover recently is this, the Sauber C37. The C37, obviously the successor to last year's C36, being fielded this year by the Sauber Alfa Romeo Ferrari Formula One team. Yeah, that's a mouthful. The Alfa Romeo connection into Sauber comes this year due to a new sponsorship lineup with Alfa Romeo and parent company Ferrari. Sergio Marchionne is of course the president of both Ferrari and Alfa Romeo. Alfa Romeo, it's a sponsorship deal only. The engine in the back of this car is from Ferrari. Alfa Romeo, not an engine supplier in Formula One this year, although potentially maybe we'll see that in seasons to come. Anyway, the C37, let's take a look at some of the technical details that we can divine from these launch spec images, and let's figure out maybe what Sauber are trying to do here. The first thing that strikes me about the C37 is just how much it really resembles last year's car, the C36. Of course, this is pretty much par for the course in Formula One, particularly in launch spec, because teams don't want to divulge any trade secrets that they may or may not have stumbled upon in the course of the off-season development. However, we see this C37, it looks relatively quiet, I would say. I'm not really seeing, at least macrocosmically, too many little aerodynamic appendages and other sorts of developments that would be considered groundbreaking or revolutionary, but let's take a look at what we do have. On this front three-quarter shot, we can very clearly see the overall design and overall layout of the car. It is pretty conventional, and it looks very similar to, again, to what we saw last year. Initially here, what strikes me on this shot, you can see the geometry of how the nose section links up to the front of the car right there. Sauber going for this smooth transition from the top of the monocoque all the way down to the nose tip, just flowing down there at a continuous angle. There are no steps in the nose, unlike what we saw last year on the Force India, and at this time we've yet to see the Force India. However, I'm led to believe that on these 2018 cars we won't be seeing any steps in the noses. I do at least hope so. Speaking of the nose, though, on this Sauber, we can see generally from this shot that they have gone for a thumbnail nose, as you can see there. Very difficult to see there with black on black, I am aware, but you can see there a thumbnail nose going on, meaning that Sauber have two little nostril inlets, if you would like, one on this side of the nose, and then of course there would be another just a little bit out of frame there on the other side of the car, with the center section of the nose coming down here to the nose tip at its lowest and most forward point. Interesting solution. We've seen other teams using this nose solution so far, therefore we can consider this conventional and par for the course. Additionally, here on this shot we can definitely tell that Sauber are utilizing a double wishbone push rod front suspension. Here's our lower wishbone. Here's our upper wishbone, and then coming down here, that is our push rod element. So double wishbone push rod suspension here on the Sauber, at least on the front end, and this is also conventional. We saw all the teams in 2017 using double wishbone push rod suspension on the front and double wishbone pull rod on the rear. Judging from this shot, looking at the rear end, it's a little bit difficult to tell whether or not Sauber have done this, but I do strongly suspect so. We can look at the geometry here. That appears to be a pull rod, and then we can't really see them, but I would suspect there to be wishbones down here and up here, making that double wishbone pull rod arrangement on the rear end as well. Additionally, from this shot, of course, we can see halo in this section. Sauber have chosen to render it in white, but very clearly you can see the relative position of the halo in that area. The car is predominantly white. The only splash of red so far on the car is only on the engine cover. I am hoping that this car gets a little bit more interesting, at least in terms of the livery, because having it predominantly white really does sort of expose the fact that Sauber don't have too many sponsors on this car, and I certainly hope that's not indicative of any financial difficulties, but with that bolstered deal with Ferrari and with the Alfa Romeo title sponsorship, I do hope that money will be coming in earnest to the Sauber team. Finally, on this shot, we can talk about turning vane detail and a little bit of side pod detail. We can see that Sauber have looked to be running three elements here on their turning vanes. We can see principal elements in this section here, and then of course we have secondary elements here and here. Again, it looks like this is an area of very rapid development so far in 2018. Teams really trying to work the flow of the air as it's coming First of all, through the front wing, and then of course around the center section of the car, through the midsection trying to feed the side pod inlets there, and then of course, probably most importantly, the teams are trying to get that flow around the rear zone of the car and start to feed the diffuser that way. So lots of complex turning vanes going on so far in 2018, and also some complex barge board activity. Finally on this shot, we can see, just like Haas and just like I assume Ferrari will be running when we eventually see the Ferrari, we can see here on either side of the monocoque, just forward of the cockpit, canard wings here on the C37. So interesting details so far on this Sauber. Let's take a look at some other shots. And on this next shot, looking at the car pretty much straight on from the front, and we can start to divine a little bit more detail now on the front wing. Sauber going for a reasonably complex front wing solution. So far, the Haas is probably the most complex that we've seen so far, but Sauber, certainly they are trying pretty hard in the area of front wing development. Obviously, of course, we have our neutral section of the main plane running across the leading edge of the wing like so in that delta profile mandated by the regulations, but toward the outboard sides of the wing, the engineers get to play. Counting flaps now, we've got our main plane, and then it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 principal flaps on the outboard section of the wing. Of course, these are really what's going to be generating the predominant amount of the front wing's downforce. Additionally here, we have a little wicker on the topmost element of the outboard flaps on the front wing on both sides there. That little wicker section there, it's a little bit easier to see on the right-hand side of this image than it is on the left due to the way the light is falling on the car. But interesting to see that little wicker / gurney flap solution going on. Very, very interesting. Additionally to all of that, we can also see cascade elements on this wing. A little bit hard to see black on black, but I'm counting 1, 2, 3, very sharply curved, and they become even more sharply curved as they move from inboard to outboard. Interesting, and you can definitely tell that Sauber are trying to steer that airflow away from the front tires to try and mitigate that turbulence, of course, that you get from these tires being in that airstream there, just big chunks of rubber there, creating all kinds of turbulence and drag. Nonetheless, Sauber really trying pretty hard here on those cascade elements. Finally, we've got more flaps on those cascade elements. Looks like 1, 2, 3 right there. It's hard to tell depth from these pictures, but where I've drawn the green lines, you can think of those flaps as being located slightly forward and slightly above the principal elements there that I've highlighted in red. Of course, these Formula One wings, they get more and more complicated every year, and of course these front wings are some of the reasons why the cars do have trouble still following nose to tail through medium and high speed corners, because they really need clean flow to be most efficient and to generate most of their downforce. Additionally, on this shot, we can get a better look at the nose tip geometry. Here is the center section of the nose tip going down. We can call it a thumbnail, and then of course on either side we have got these nostrils here. It looks black on this shot, but it is not a solid piece. These are openings, and air would be allowed to pass through there to either side of the wing and start to feed the under tray of this car. This shot confirms the double wishbone push rod geometry on the front suspension. Here's your upper wishbone right there, your lower wishbone right here, and then of course the push rod coming down there. So we've confirmed the suspension geometry on this car. Very conventional, par for the course here, 2017 and 2018 it does appear so far. Also on this shot, we can get a better look at the turning vane solutions, and we can start to divine even more detail now. Here are the mirror fairings on this Sauber, pretty much in their conventional locations and pretty much in a location that's mandated by the regulations, but we can start to see these multiple elements of these turning vanes and flow modifiers along the midsection of the monocoque. This is some sort of winglet here that is running slightly arrears and below the height of the mirror fairings. Additionally, we have got this little horizontal winglet, which appears to link up with this turning vane here. which follows a very cool profile of itself, actually somewhat reminiscent of the profile on the rear wing. Very interesting. Of course, this is a ubiquitous profile that everybody's running on their rear wing end fences, but very cool to see that Sauber are mirroring that shape there on the turning vane. Very interesting. Additionally, we have got those two more turning vanes here. This one is linked up to the inboard one, and then this final one coming down. Yes, very narrow lines, unfortunately, that we've got to draw here. They all appear to be connected to each other. They're not freestanding elements. I'm not quite sure how these are manufactured or how they're mounted to the car. It's difficult to tell at this point, but it appears that these are separate elements that are functioning as a single element. So these different components being mounted in the same section of the car, very closely related to each other, and it appears that Sauber are trying to get them to function as one cohesive unit. So certainly a lot of very sophisticated wind tunnel work and CFD work going on in the development of this car already. That is very encouraging to see from a little team like Sauber, which of course we all know that they tend to be very well versed in the black art of aerodynamics, but resources are this team's problem. Maybe we're starting to see the benefit of some of that Ferrari money coming across now into Switzerland, and hopefully this car can start to lift Sauber's fortunes a little bit. Additionally, on this shot, we can see the side pod openings, very small, somewhat narrow, but very nicely sculpted here. One trend that is becoming pretty apparent in these 2018 cars is just the amount of packaging work that they're able to do. These cars are so narrowly waisted nowadays, and we'll be able to take a better look at this in a couple of minutes, but these cars are so narrow in the rear zone now that I'm not entirely sure if the colloquial Coke bottle shape that we've always been using to describe the general shape of Formula One cars, I'm not sure if that's still appropriate anymore, because these cars are just so tightly packaged now. They're more so resemblant of funnels than they are of Coke bottles nowadays. Maybe we can start to change the terminology a little bit. Of course, from this shot, we can also see the cockpit zone. Of course, that's dominated by halo, but we can also see the geometry of the air box on this car, that snorkel area. Just like they did last year, Sauber are dividing their snorkel inlet here into two main chambers, one on each side, basically following this sort of profile. Very cool. And additionally, just above that and slightly arrears, we have a third opening on the snorkel. It's bifurcated here by the mounting for the T-cam, but I do believe it's one continuous opening, just right up in that section. So Sauber running three separate inlets on their air snorkel. I imagine the two lower openings are for engine air, turbocharger intake, and then the upper one is probably for gearbox cooling or for KERS cooling, things like that. But that's my idea in terms of what Sauber are probably trying to do there with the snorkel. But from this shot, definitely some very cool aerodynamic work happening with this Sauber. And on this next shot, we can see the car from side on here. Unfortunately, it does become apparent on this shot that the resolution is not the best, at least not in these versions of the launch spec pictures that I've been able to obtain. Nevertheless, we can still figure out a little bit of detail in terms of what Sauber are doing here. The overall lateral profile of the car, it does appear to be pretty quiet. Sauber being a little bit conservative in that regard. Of course, they are limited by the regulations, but the details that we can start to divine are pretty interesting. First of all, let's look at the barge board area on this car. The first thing that I do want to point out is that there is some sort of element right in this section here, forward and a little bit below the principal barge boards. I can't really tell from this shot what that is. The detail is not good enough, but there's something there in that little red box that I've drawn. We'll definitely have to keep our eyes peeled for that. Additionally, though, we can see the primary barge board detail in this section of the car inside this red box. Very, very interesting design work there. The resolution is not the highest, I am aware, but it does appear that on the top edge of the barge board in roughly this section here, Sauber have included little serrations, very much in the style of Mercedes in 2017, right in that section there of the top edge of the barge board. So again, really interesting to see that this little team is able to do that wind tunnel work and to do that CFD work to work on the details of this car. Maybe the car by itself appears to be a little bit quiet, but the details, aerodynamically speaking, are definitely very well thought out. Additionally to those little serrations, it does appear, and this could be a trick of the light, but it does appear that there are horizontal elements as well on the leading surface of the barge board right there. This would be directly exposed to the airstream. So perhaps some sort of vortex generator activity going on here, but again, the overall rationale is to try and get that airflow through the front section of the car, around the barge boards, and then start to funnel it toward the rear zone like so. Of course, some of that flow is going to be split going upward a bit into the air intakes on the side pods, and then some more still will be funneled around those air intakes and around the side pod, again trying to feed the rear zone of the car like that. But certainly Sauber doing a lot of detailed aerodynamic work, very impressive for this little team, even though we've known for a bunch of years that they have one of the best wind tunnels in the world, and other companies in motorsport and not do rent out the Sauber wind tunnel on occasion. So definitely very, very cool. Additional details here on this car. We can see halo, and yeah, we all know what halo looks like, but Sauber are doing something with their halo. Right up here in this section, you can see that there is a little winglet installed on the top surface of halo. From this shot, it's a little bit difficult to see if it actually goes all around the circumference of the halo all the way back to the cockpit surround, but there is definitely a little winglet structure right there on halo. If I were a betting man, I would say that this is probably to condition the flow as it comes across the halo toward the air snorkel. Of course, halo being where it is, it's absolutely dreadful for airflow, but air coming across the front end of the car, it's going to intersect the halo, and halo is probably going to have some sort of propensity to push that airflow up and away from the car. What Sauber are doing with this little winglet section, I would believe, is to try and get that airflow to remain attached to the top section of halo so that they can feed the air snorkel roughly in that attitude. Again, just an idea, but this is the first time on these launch spec cars that we're seeing fairing work on the halo to this extent, so certainly look for other teams to be doing things along this vein. Additionally, on this shot, we can see a good profile view of the engine cover. No shark fins or T-wings for 2018, so we can see the profile of the engine cover just going down at a constant angle to where it cuts off, and then the rear wing structure begins. Additionally, we can also see the support pylons here on the rear wing. There are two of them on the Sauber, and they're following this little hook profile here. The other one is somewhat blocked from view, but we can see Sauber using a double pylon solution to support that rear wing main plane. And then, of course, the other supports coming from the end fences there. We can also see the DRS actuation pod right here. This is housing the armature that actually opens and closes the slot gap there on the DRS. And finally, we can start to divine some detail on the rear wing end fences themselves. Very aggressive trailing edge profile there on those rear wing end fences. Very cool. And then, of course, the lateral geometry of them, if we're talking about going inboard to outboard, still pretty much following this overall profile as we have seen on all of the 2017 cars and so far all of the 2018 cars. So interesting things going on with this Sauber here, but still, overall, it is a little bit quiet. And here on this next shot, now we're taking a look at the rear section of the car from a rear three-quarter view, looking from the right. Very cool shot, because for the first time here on a launch spec 2018 car, we can get a very clear view of what's going on here with the diffuser treatment. Sauber, unlike some other teams, they're not covering up this diffuser, and what we see is something pretty complicated, but very reminiscent of what Ferrari were doing last year on their diffuser. We have three distinct topside elements on this diffuser. It's a little bit difficult to highlight on this shot, but you can see just in this section, you can see that there are three different trailing edges there on the top side of the diffuser. So if you look at the Ferrari SF70H from 2017, you'll see a very similar treatment going on with the top side of their diffuser. Sauber definitely integrating a similar design. Also, what this shot confirms for us, what we were suspecting on the Haas video here, is we can see the exhaust outlets right here. We can see that Sauber are going for that triple element exhaust. Obviously in the center we have our main turbine exhaust, and on either side we have got exhausts for the turbo wastegates mounted there in that pattern of 1+2 turbo wastegates, the smaller pipes on either side of the principal turbine exhaust. So that's what the Ferrari engine is requiring this year. So that's what we would be expecting to see on the Haas, obviously here on the Sauber, and most likely on the factory Ferraris once we see those cars. So there's your exhaust treatment on the Ferrari powered cars. Additionally, on this shot, we can see the profile of those rear wing end fences in more detail here, following that same sort of geometry that we have been seeing since 2017, but just the final treatment here, right there in that section on the trailing edge of the top side of the wing. You can see that you've got the main plane, which cuts off right here, and then you have the end fence, which cuts off right here. So very aggressive and a very nice styling decision, I must say, on the Sauber. Of course, here on the back, you can see Alfa Romeo sponsorship on this section of the wing. That is very conspicuously displayed, as is the Alfa logo on the engine cover. And of course, here, this is the slot gap. This will open and close when the driver actuates DRS. Also on this shot, we can see the midsection and bottom side of the diffuser a little bit. You can see the strakes coming down here from top to bottom. This just conditioning the airflow as it starts to be shot out the back of the car, roughly in this sort of profile. Very, very cool. Also, we can see detail on the rear crash structure. Very large, and of course this is basically homologated in the regulations. This, of course, is to absorb impact energy from rear-end collisions, and it does integrate the rain light as we have been seeing. Interesting to note here, we don't see a monkey seat on this Sauber. We're not seeing some sort of winglet mounted roughly in this area, but we are seeing somewhat of a flared section on the fairing that surrounds the rain light, roughly in that section. So Sauber definitely trying to manipulate the exhaust flow a little bit with that raised fairing section there on the rear crash structure. Probably it's not as effective as the monkey seat, but this is a little bit of exhaust blowing going on with the rear zone of this Sauber. So again, the whole car looks a little bit quiet, but when you look at the details, you can see that Sauber have really thought about this thing and that they're trying to exploit even small advantages like being able to blow that rear crash structure with the exhaust gases. Very cool design work, and again, it shows me that they have really thought about this car very intently. Also on this shot, we can see more detail of those turning vanes here. Here's our principal turning vane following a pretty normal profile, and then we can see the two outboard turning vanes following in this profile, curving into 90 degrees, and then this one, which is more or less just vertical. Really, really nice aero detail on this Sauber. I'm impressed. I'm definitely impressed. And of course, this car with the Ferrari engine, we'll see how reliable it is, but the Ferrari engine has proven to be pretty reliable so far in the turbo hybrid era. It's not the most powerful, but if Sauber can get a competitive engine and a reasonably reliable one, maybe we can start to see some good results from this little team in Switzerland. Finally, on this shot, I just want to highlight the lower side of the rear wing end fences. You can see these gills that have been cut vertically, 3 of them per side, into the rear wing end fences there. Very nice detail once again here on this Sauber. And on this next shot, this is the shot that I've personally been waiting to see so far in 2018. This is taken from roughly the location of the T-wing on top of the air snorkel where our onboard cameras are going to be mounted, and very clearly you can start to figure out the kind of view that we're going to be getting from the TV onboards in 2018. Dominating this image is Halo, quite clearly in this section. This means that we can't see the front end of the car anymore as it's going around on track, at least not from this angle. We can't see any of the front suspension. We can barely see the front wheels. You can just see the trailing side of the front tires right here on either side, but we can't see the front side, which would be roughly in this area here on both sides. We can't see the front suspension, which would be roughly in this area. So really, we have somewhat of a disturbed onboard view in 2018. This, in my estimation, is not going to be very good for television coverage. Of course, those of you in the United States, you know that we're facing a crisis in Formula One coverage this year, but the coverage that is out there, they're using these cameras, and basically the only thing you're going to be able to see is the driver, the steering wheel, and then the track kind of out there in the distance. You're not going to be able to look at the corners, apex to apex anymore, as the driver's able to do, because this halo is going to be in the way. Just like the drivers, our gaze from the onboard cameras is going to be shifted very far forward, so it's going to be difficult to really watch the driver working in real time, but this is what we have to deal with. The other detail that we can define from this shot, though, remember we talked about that winglet structure on the halo. Here it is. You can see the slot gap here on that winglet as it's following around the profile of halo. It does appear to be at least semi-circumferential. I'm not entirely sure if it goes all the way around the halo because we can't see the entire halo from this shot, but you can see here that we've got this slot gap. And additionally, you can see that it is not a continuous winglet. We have these stays here mounted strategically to support that upper wing element on the halo. Again, I think this is just more so in the realm of airflow conditioning rather than trying to generate downforce with it. And again, my hypothesis, just trying to steer that air toward the airbox to make sure the engine still gets its proper intake and proper cooling air. Also, we can get some cockpit detail going on in this car. Looks very similar to what we've been seeing in general from the Formula One cars, really going back to 2010 or so. The cockpit layout hasn't changed all that much in recent years, but you can definitely see what Sauber are doing with the steering wheel, just as we have been seeing pretty much ubiquitously, except for Williams so far. You can see the steering wheel with that big LCD monitor in the center. This, of course, is giving the driver all sorts of information about what's going on. He can see speed, temperatures, lap times, race position, any messages that the pit crew might have for him, all there. Really cool steering wheels in Formula One, I must say. And of course, you can see the rest of the cockpit, just generally how things are sorted. This isn't high enough resolution to be able to see what all the different controls do, but you can see most of the controls now in the modern Formula One cars, they are mounted on the steering wheel, and there's really not much on the sides of the cockpit, just a little bit in this area, probably for master ignition kill, things that would be catastrophic to hit by accident, but for the most part, all the controls on the steering wheel, really interesting to see. And on this last shot, taking a closer look at that steering wheel. We're not quite at driver's eye position. We're a little bit too low here, so this is not the view the driver would be getting, but we can take a closer look at the steering wheel here on this Sauber. Very nicely sorted, and it is a logical progression in terms of what Sauber have been putting on their steering wheels in the last few seasons. Obviously, we have got the big controls here. Here's our neutral button. Here's our pit lane speed limiter. This appears to be a button for reverse. This appears to be the overtake button. And then, of course, all of these rotary switches here in the center section of the wheel. I'm talking about these. These are for more detailed settings. These are for changing different pages on the LCD monitor so that the driver can start to manipulate settings in all sorts of different areas of the car. We can see this rotary switch here. It is labeled as mid, so this is probably some sort of differential adjustment. Down here, mode, so this probably has to do with controlling the MGU systems and probably engine mapping as well. This side, this is probably for tires and for throttle maps in terms of different rates of tire wear, different tire compounds, things like that. Just the number of settings that the driver has to play with in these modern Formula One cars is absolutely ridiculous. It gets so finely detailed. It's really, really interesting to try and wrap your head around all of that. And of course, if you're going to drive one of these cars competitively, you'd better be intimate with every single switch, every single button, and every single operating mode that this steering wheel makes available to you. Very cool. Obviously, this switch here looks like it's got 13 different positions. It's labeled as spark, so this is probably an engine map setting for ignition timing and probably fuel injection density, things like that. Might be able to manipulate the turbocharger as well. Just different maps trying to save fuel if you need to, or to give you more power for qualifying, things like that. And then, of course, your main rotary in the center. This is for all of your principal operating modes, and then from here, depending on where this center switch is in its selection position, it will influence the operation of all of the other controls going on, and then the driver will be able to switch pages and be able to manipulate all kinds of things. Really interesting. Additionally, on the Sauber, we can see that we've got some thumb wheel activity. A little difficult to see, but I believe we've got a thumb wheel over here, as well as over here. This one is labeled entry, so this is probably entry differential settings on corner entry. EB, this is probably engine braking. We've got a thumb wheel here. SOC, this is state of charge, so this is probably some sort of MGUK harvest setting there. Just really complicated stuff going on. Of course, here's our DRS button. This will open and close the DRS flap in those designated DRS zones. And of course, on the back side of the wheel, we can just see them a little bit here. These appear to be the clutch paddles. This is what actuates the clutch here. No foot-operated clutch in a Formula 1 car. The driver does it with one of two paddles on the back of the steering wheel. It's just a linear actuation. The driver really, though, only uses the clutch at the race start, at the pit stop, and if ever he needs to drive very slowly, he'll just feather the clutch to keep the car creeping along there, just like you would do in a road car, but you're doing it with your fingers and not your foot. Anyway, though, that does appear to be all of the detail that we've got here on the steering wheel, and as well as all the detail that we've got going on with the Sauber C37. Again, my overall verdict on the car, it's quiet, but it is very nicely detailed. Sauber taking the time to look at the aerodynamic details on this car, and obviously its immediate predecessor, trying to figure out what they did right and what they did wrong, just so that they can improve it as an overall package. I do expect to see this car develop at least somewhat over the course of the season. It depends on the resources, though, that the little Sauber team has to play with. Again, that Ferrari money coming in, the Alfa Romeo sponsorship deal, and the Ferrari engine supply, all going to play a critical role this year for the fortunes of Sauber. However, that is all I've got for you in this video. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you very much for watching, and we will see you soon.